Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our first unit after the midterm, Unit 5 on Death, Afterlife, and Eschatology. It is important to note that there is no chapter on Death, Afterlife, and Eschatology in your textbooks, but rather that we're going to be focusing on readings from Mircea Eliade from his 1974 book, Death, Afterlife, and Eschatology. This PDF of this reading with all of the 5 possible readings for Unit 5 are in a PDF on Blackboard and can be accessed at any time and can be found under Unit 5 here. But for now, let us begin. Now, the first thing I want you guys to do is take a moment to pause this and go to YouTube and watch the opening from Adam Ruins Death from the True TV show Adam Ruins Everything. So I'm just going to take a moment and pause this recording while you guys go ahead and watch that. All done? Well, one of the reasons why I had you watch that is because one of the things that we think of when we think about myth is we think that it's not bound by any sort of scientific reality. If people can sort of become immortal if they want, they can have a state of existence without death. However, this is rooted in the popular definition of mythology as an outmoded or false idea. Remember that the anthropological definition of mythology is that myths are sacred stories central to the belief systems and values of a given people, culture, or religion. And as such, myths function in several ways, not just as explanations, but as ways of teaching important, valuable lessons, cultural morals, and ideas, as well as helping people accept some of the basic truths of human existence. As you saw from watching that video, one of the basic truths of human existence is that all human beings grow old and die. Not surprisingly, as a result, stories about life, death, and the afterlife are found in myths from all over the world, but they're not focused on helping people to attain immortality or a state of existence without death. That doesn't give them that false hope. Cultures create these stories in order to help human beings deal with this truth, dealing with the truth that they will one day die. Reminding human beings that they will all eventually die is a common thread throughout world mythology. Not caring to think about their own death, many mythological figures search for a form of immortality. However, this is frequently considered a form of hubris, extreme haughtiness or arrogance, usually one that gets you in trouble with the gods. Hubris often indicates being out of touch with reality and overestimating your own competence or capabilities, especially for people in power. A great example of this is found in the story of Gilgamesh from ancient Babylonian mythology. In the image on the right here, we see Gilgamesh wrestling and defeating the sacred bull of heaven. In the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh, as punishment for defeating the sacred bull of heaven, the gods decree that Gilgamesh's best friend Enkidu must die. And when Enkidu, who is Gilgamesh's equal, dies, the great hero Gilgamesh realizes that he himself is also vulnerable and might die. And so therefore he goes on a quest to find immortality. For this, he goes in search of Utnapishtim, who is the only human being ever to be granted immortality by the gods for surviving the Great Flood. Please note that Utnapishtim is a great sort of example of what we'd consider a flood myth, or similar to the myth of Noah in the Bible. However, what Gilgamesh fails to grasp is that Utnapishtim's immortality was granted by the gods. Apotheosis, or the state of becoming a god, is always because that state of immortality is granted by the gods. It is never taken for human beings by themselves. In the picture in the lower left here, we see an example, the apotheosis of Hercules, where Hercules has been granted immortality by the gods and becomes a god based on the decision of the other Greek gods. Hercules himself does not strive for this. He does not go after this, and therefore he is not guilty of hubris. Gilgamesh, on the other hand, is guilty of hubris, so his quest to attain immortality is always destined to fail. So what's one of the sort of important things to know is that these myths are not really about demonstrating how immortality is possible, but helping people cope with the idea of their own mortality and the mortality of their loved ones. Part of accepting the mortality of both yourself and loved ones is through death rituals. These are rituals found in human cultures which involve death either in one of three forms, either as ritual killing, including both human sacrifice and animal sacrifice, rituals for the veneration of the dead, and funeral rituals. These death rituals vary extensively with time and place, and often these various rituals are tied directly into mythology and theology. They can provide a critical insight into cultures and their relations with the other world, as well as their ideas about life and death. Of these three, the one that we are most familiar with is funeral rituals. So we're going to go over each of these in turn, starting with the first, which is, of course, killing. Now, the offering up of a sacrifice to the gods in the form of animals is extraordinarily common. We see it with the sacrifice of goats, chicken, and other animals in religions such as Voodoo and Santeria, and the sacrifice of animals such as bulls, pigs, goats, cows, calves, etc. in ancient Greek and Roman religion, and in other religions as well. In the Srauta tradition of the Vedic Hindu religion, there was a practice called Ashvamedha, which was the sacrifice of horses. This was actually also a ritual of divine right used by ancient Indian kings to prove their imperial sovereignty. In addition, we still see some of these examples of animal sacrifice still practiced today. A great example is found in Islam. In Islam, there is a holiday called Eid al-Adha, on which a ram or male sheep is sacrificed. This is done in honor of actually an example of human sacrifice from the Bible, which is the story of Abraham and Isaac. In the story of Abraham and Isaac, as depicted in the upper left-hand corner here, God gives Abraham a test of faith, asking him to sacrifice his only son Isaac in honor of God. Abraham, who is absolutely obedient to God, agrees to commit the sacrifice, but is stopped by an angel at the very last moment and instead given a ram to sacrifice, as this was only a test of faith. We see other examples of human sacrifice from all over the world. Among the Celts, you had the practice of the wicker man, whereby they would entomb criminals in a wooden effigy of their god and set it alight. We have the practice of human sacrifice among the Aztecs and Maya. The Aztecs actually believed that Huitzilopochtli, or the god of the sun, required human sacrifice and the blood of human sacrifices in order to survive his nightly battle with Coyolxauhqui, his evil sister, the moon. If at any point Huitzilopochtli were to fail in this battle, the sun would wink out of existence, and the moon and stars would then descend upon the world and destroy it. So there are plenty of examples of this happening too. We also see rituals for the veneration of the dead. It's important to note that rituals for the veneration of the dead are different than funerals. Funerals usually take place shortly after a person has passed, and is usually a way for the family to share their memories of a loved one, to say goodbye to the loved one, and to mourn. Rituals for the veneration of the dead, however, are different. They usually take place on a set calendar date, usually about once a year, and they are done as a way of showing respect and honor towards one's deceased ancestors. Specifically, rituals for the veneration of the dead are based on the idea that the souls of the dead can continue to affect the lives of the living. Examples include the Day of the Dead in Mexico. The ancient Romans practiced Feralia, which was a yearly holiday wherein they would go to the tomb of their ancestors and pour out a liquid libation of wine, milk, or water in their honor. If they did not do this, then their ancestors could come back and haunt them. In Asian cultures such as China and Korea, you have the Ghost Festival, in which offerings of food, incense, alcohol, wine, or even money are offered to the souls of one's deceased ancestors within the home. Funeral rites are the death rituals with which we are most familiar. These take place shortly or usually almost immediately after death, although there are some exceptions. They usually involve some sort of eulogy or speech in honor of the dead person, some visitation or viewing of the body, or viewing of remembrances of the deceased individual, some form of treatment of the body, and often some sort of ritual meal. In the lower right-hand corner here, we see an example from the Etruscans, who would really have essentially a drinking party at the death of a loved one, and this was so entrenched as part of their culture that even their tombs were depicted as if they were the tents in which these lavish drinking parties occurred. So you can see that funeral rituals, while common throughout various world cultures, can differ greatly from culture to culture, but usually involve at least one of these four elements. So now that we've talked about death a little bit, let's talk a little bit about what comes after death, the very idea of the afterlife. Simply put, the afterlife is whatever state of existence takes place after death. Most commonly, it refers to the idea that the consciousness or mind continues after the death of the body occurs, either by natural or supernatural means. In most religious and mythological traditions, there are two types of afterlife. These are reincarnation and resurrection. Reincarnation, also called transmigration or metempsychosis, is believed to occur when the soul, after the death of the body, comes back to life in a newborn body. This is most common in Indian traditions such as Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, and Buddhism. Resurrection, on the other hand, is more common in Abrahamic religions such as Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scriptures, or in also is found in Norse or Viking mythology. The term resurrection refers to the coming back to life of a dead person, either the literal coming back to life of biologically dead corpses by divine power, what we might call zombies, or the resurrection of the dead into a different state of being, heaven, hell, purgatory, limbo, etc. For example, in Viking culture, if a Viking died a brave death, they might be brought to the halls of Valhalla, where they will drink and fight in the honor of the gods forever. Whereas if they were evil or cowardly, they might be sent to Niflheim and its capital city of Hell, where they would be devoured by the serpentine beast who ruled over that region of the Nine Worlds. So here we see there's two basic versions of the afterlife, reincarnation and resurrection. Let's take a look at two different versions of reincarnation, one from Hinduism and one from Buddhism. Reincarnation in Hinduism is called samsara. Essentially, they use the term samsara to refer to the continuous cycle of reincarnation. You're born, you live, you die, and you're born again. In Hinduism, it's your soul, or Atman as it's called, that is reincarnated over and over and over again. However, your karma, or your good or bad actions that you commit during your lifetime, help determine the destiny of each of these next lives. This is tied in with the Hindu caste system, a system of social stratification and social restrictions in Hinduism. Essentially, you could be born into any number of the different castes depending on your good or bad actions in the previous life. So if you were a member of, say, the Kshatriya or warrior caste, and you had good karma, you may come back as a member of the Brahmin or priest caste. Whereas if you had bad karma, you might come back as a Vyasya, which is a landowner or merchant, a Sudra, which is a peasant, or even the Dalit or untouchables. And you would move up or down the system of social stratification with each new life, depending on your karma. Now, please note this is not a widespread practice in India anymore. There are many members of lower castes, including the so-called untouchables or Dalit, who hold high positions in the government and play important roles in modern Indian life and Hindu religion. Now, the ultimate goal of every Hindu is to break free of this cycle of reincarnation and achieve moksha, or the state of enlightenment, the perfect understanding of all things. This is essentially the ultimate goal of every Hindu and the pinnacle of sort of the way of getting out of the caste system. Here we can see an example of how the caste system works. You may be reincarnated in a number of different levels of the caste system. At the bottom are the Harijans or Dalit, the outcasts, untouchables, children of God. Above them are the Sudras or unskilled workers. Then there are the Vyasyas, who are the skilled traders, merchants, and minor officials. The Kshatriyas, who are the warriors and rulers, and the Brahmins, who are the priests. Every time you move through your life, you may move up and down the caste system in different places, eventually hoping to achieve moksha or enlightenment. System of reincarnation in Buddhism is similar but different in other ways. Firstly, there's no soul in Buddhism, in Buddhist belief systems. Instead, anyone and everything are part of the continuing cycle of rebirth of the universe as a whole. Secondly, while your karma, good or bad deeds, affect how close you are to enlightenment, there is no caste system in Buddhism, and your karma does not affect how or into what social class you are reborn. And the third thing that's important to note is that the state of enlightenment is referred to as nirvana in Buddhism, as opposed to moksha. From here, let's move on to resurrection, the most common type of afterlife found in Western religions. Resurrection is essentially the belief that the soul of a dead person continues to exist after death. The most common form of resurrection is a spiritual resurrection, the resurrection of the soul into a different state of being or place, such as heaven, hell, Valhalla, etc. It's important to note that resurrection does not just take place for human beings or heroes or mythological figures, but can even happen to gods. In mythology, there are gods referred to as life, death, and rebirth deities, also known as dying and rising or resurrection deities. These are gods or other mythological figures who suffer death or a death-like experience, pass through a phase in the underworld among the dead, and are subsequently reborn. Examples include Jesus from Christian mythology, Osiris from Egyptian mythology, who was carved up into many pieces by his brother Set. All the pieces were collected by Osiris's wife Isis, brought to Anubis, the god of mummification, who put them all back together, and Osiris was reborn as the god of the underworld. And then we also have Odin, who at Ragnarok, or the end of the world, will supposedly be swallowed up by a giant wolf named Fenrir, only to be born again at the creation of a new world. Now, it's important to note that while spiritual forms of resurrection are most common, there are also examples of physical resurrection, the resurrection of a person's soul into their own body. Even though it's technically incorrect, we're going to use the term zombie to describe this type of resurrection. Now, why is the use of this term actually technically incorrect? Well, because we actually get the word zombie from the Haitian or voodoo zombie. This is a term that refers to a reanimated person controlled by someone else by the use of magic. In the West African spiritual belief system of voodoo or vodun, these people are brought back and being controlled as laborers or slaves by a powerful wizard called a bokor. This is very different from the way that most physical resurrections happen in other world religions. And yet we see that the term, because of popular culture, the term zombie has become really the most prevalent term to describe a reanimated physical human being. So we're going to use that term here. The two other types of zombie that we see are the mythological zombie and the hostile zombie. The mythological zombie is a human being who has died and then is brought back to life through magic or through divine intervention. We see that in a number of different places. We see it with Lazarus from the Bible being brought back to life by Jesus. We see it in the story of Pare from Maori mythology, and we see it depicted here in this center illustration with the resurrection of Prince Lohiau from the myth of the fire goddess, the myth of Pele, which is one of the 5 myths from Unit 3 that we took a close look at. From there, we also have the hostile zombie. The hostile zombie is basically a reanimated corpse that comes back to attack the living. This is the version that we see most commonly in modern pop cultures and movies like Night of the Living Dead and The Walking Dead and stuff like that. But there are many examples found in world folklore and world mythology. Christian mythology have the revenant and vampire. You have the ghoul in Arab or Muslim mythology. You have the Draugr in Norse or Viking mythology. If anyone listening to this video lecture has ever played Skyrim, you've fought a Draugr or two. You have the Jiangxi from Chinese mythology, and you have the Onryo from Japanese mythology, as depicted in the lower right-hand corner here. If any of you have ever seen The Grudge or The Ring, you know basically what an Onryo looks like. They're usually a resurrected evil spirit, usually depicted with long black hair. So we have several versions of this from throughout world mythology. Now, it's important from here that I also talk about something called the Orphic myth. Now, this is something that's found in close connection to myths about resurrection. Orphic myths tell the story of an individual's descent to, and often their return from, the underworld. Orphic myths are called Orphic after the most famous of these myths, the myth of Orpheus, a Greek hero who was said to have learned to play the lyre, a musical instrument as depicted here in this picture, from Apollo himself. Perhaps the most famous myth in which Orpheus figures is that of his wife Eurydice. While walking at her wedding to Orpheus, Eurydice fell into a nest of vipers and suffered a fatal bite on her heel. Her body was discovered by Orpheus, who, overcome with grief, played such sad and mournful songs that all the gods themselves wept. On their advice, Orpheus traveled to the underworld, and by his music softened the hearts of Hades and Persephone, the god and goddess of the underworld, who agreed to allow Eurydice to return with him to Earth on one condition. As a test of faith, he should walk in front of her and not look back until they both had reached the upper world. He set off with Eurydice following, and in his anxiety, as soon as he reached the upper world, he turned to look at her, forgetting that they both needed to be in the upper world, and she vanished for a second time, this time forever. It's a very, very sad story, but one which is repeated again and again throughout world mythology. These Orphic myths, which tell the story of an individual's descent into and often return from the underworld, are very common, what Claude Lévi-Strauss called a mytheme, the essential kernel of a myth, an irreducible, unchanging element that is shared by multiple myths across multiple cultures and time periods. For the final exam, you can always memorize this, or you can do what I do and just realize that mytheme is a portmanteau or amalgamation of the words myth and theme. So simply put, a mytheme is the theme of a myth. If you want to put that on the final, that's perfectly okay. Now, Orphic myths describe a process that was called katabasis by the Greeks, literally a descent or going down into the underworld. It's found in many common myths, including those of Homer's Odyssey, the story of Orpheus, the story of Aeneas from Roman mythology, the story of Gilgamesh, which is one of the 5 myths you can read for Unit 5, the story of Balder and Hermod from Norse mythology, Izanagi and Izanami from Japanese mythology, and many others. The last thing that I want to talk to you guys about today before we close out this lecture is eschatology. If death is the ultimate destiny of a person, then eschatology is the destiny of mankind as a whole. Essentially, eschatology is the study of how various mythological traditions view the end of the world. From a biblical sense in Christian mythology, this is referred to as the apocalypse, Armageddon, the second coming, but is found in many non-biblical mythical traditions as well. Examples include Kali Yuga from Hindu mythology, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, as depicted by this woodcut by Albrecht Dürer on the upper left-hand corner, Koilzakhui, the evil goddess of the moon descending on the world and destroying it, as found in Aztec mythology, or the story of Ragnarok from the Bible, a story of how the battles between the gods on the one hand and the wolves and giants on the other will bring about an end to mankind. However, it's important to note that not all eschatological traditions are the same. Many of them deal with something called a last judgment, the idea that at the end of the world, the souls of human beings will live on, but that the ultimate fates of these souls will rest in how these souls are judged by a god or goddess or series of gods. If they're judged to be good, then they will move on to a place which will be a paradise. We find this in Christian mythology, in Muslim mythology, and in Viking mythology, where the good would go to heaven. In Muslim mythology, they would go to Jannah, which is another word of saying paradise or heaven. And in Norse mythology, they would go to Valhalla. If, however, they were considered bad, then they would go usually to a bad place. These would include, hell, which is called Jahannam in Muslim mythology, or Niflheim in Norse mythology. As a matter of fact, Hell, which is the capital city of Niflheim in Norse mythology, is where we get the word hell in English. In most cultures, for Christian cultures, they actually use the term inferno to refer to hell, and paradisio for paradise, for heaven. So it's important to note that you're going to find either a utopia or perfect existence for those who behaved well, or a dystopia or hellish existence for those who behaved poorly. And that pretty much covers our section on death, afterlife, and eschatology. As we move forward, I'd like you guys to download the PDF from Death, Afterlife, and Eschatology by Mircea Eliade. And I would like you to choose one of the following myths from your book, or from that reading. Oh, here we have the depiction of the idea of the Last Judgment that I talked about before. So, these include selections from the Epic of Gilgamesh, from ancient Babylonian culture in Mesopotamia. That's found in the reading. We have the story of the funeral rites of the Turaja people from Turaja mythology. Now, the reading from this from Mircea Eliade is rather dense and outdated. So if you go on YouTube and actually search Turaja funerals or Turaja death rituals, then you'll be able to actually gain a lot more information than might ordinarily be available from the reading. I will actually be posting some of these videos under Unit 5 for this class. There are also, our next two myths are actually both Orphic myths. We have the story of Hutu and Pare, or a Polynesian Orpheus from the Maori people of New Zealand, and a Californian Orpheus from the Tachiyokut people of the Native American tribe from modern-day California. And last but not least, we have Muhammad Speaks of the Day of Doom, which talks about the end of the world, or Last Judgment in Muslim mythology, wherein the good go to Jannah or paradise, and the bad go to hell. So I would like you to pick one of these myths to read, and as you go through and read them, I would like you to answer these two questions. Number one, what themes associated with death does this myth address? Does it talk about the inevitability of death, immortality, hubris, reincarnation, resurrection, the afterlife, Orphic myths, the end of the world, etc.? And number two, what do the views of death and the afterlife expressed in this myth say about the culture from which it originates. As always, this assignment will be due uploaded to Blackboard by the end of Unit 5. It's been a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you guys for Unit 6.